Anyway, how y'all doing tonight? Cool. I appreciate y'all all coming tonight. Let me tell y'all a little bit about myself. I was actually not born in Alabama. I was born in North Carolina. My father graduated from Auburn with a degree in electrical engineering. Got a job with Western Electric in Winston-Salem, which is where I was born. Probably about 2 years later, my mother decided she'd had enough. She wanted to go back home to Alabama, so we got a job in Huntsville at Chrysler. They're a big defense contractor. I grew up there, graduated from high school, eventually finished college. I was on the 8 years into 4 plan, but eventually I made it. Scattered, worked various and sundry jobs before I finally wound up getting a part-time job as a videotape editor at the CBS station up there. That eventually became a full-time position as a photographer. I worked several TV stations along the way before I eventually ended up at the NBC station in Birmingham. First as a photographer, then as an assignment editor. That's 2.5 years of my life I'll never get back. And my last job was operating a satellite truck. If you don't know what a satellite truck is, it's a big box truck with a dish on the roof, and you're looking for satellites in geosynchronous orbit above the equator. Now, if that don't mean nothing to you, if you ever see these fools standing on the beach reporting about a hurricane, I made that happen. In my years running a satellite truck, I rode out 8 hurricanes. I rode out Hurricane Ivan behind Holiday Inn in Foley. I rode out Hurricane Katrina behind a Walmart in Biloxi, Mississippi. I used to be afraid of hurricanes. They eventually just became very wet pains they were wet. Another aspect of my job was I spent a lot of time on the road. In my 8 years at Channel 13, I managed to drive nearly 250,000 miles. I saw a lot of Alabama. It happened to be in the fall of 2007. I was going from Birmingham to Auburn to cover some story. I don't even remember what it was. All I know is about halfway between Childersburg and Sylacauga up in Talladega County was this old rusting 1957 Chevy Bel Air sitting up on the side of the road. I had a little time to kill, so I thought, you know what, I'm gonna stop and check this thing out. It turns out what you can't see from the highway is it's over a little bit of a hill there. It was about 30 or 40 acres of ancient rusting cars. I mean, we're talking cars that date back to the 1920s. Nothing was newer than the mid-1960s. It was truly a fascinating time capsule of rust. The problem was I didn't have a camera with me that day. And I realized I should never go anywhere without a camera ever. As I continued my travels, I started to notice other things. A sign for a business that didn't exist anymore, an old collapsing farmhouse out in the countryside, a country store that's been closed 30 years, at an intersection in the middle of nowhere. I started to see this stuff everywhere. And it was starting to occur to me that one of these days, all these things are going to be gone. When it really hit home for me was another time I was going down 280. Hey, Chance, you're supposed to be taking pictures, not chit-chatting. Okay, am I loud enough? You're old people. So you're owning the fact that you're old. Okay, all right, can you hear me better now? Do you hear me better now? Do you hear me? Good. I talk loud as it is. Come on, y'all. Anyway, going back to my story, I was going down 280 again one time. There's a little town southeast of Birmingham called Chelsea. And I still remember it. I can still see it in my mind. It was this 1960 Shell gas station. You knew it was a Shell station because of the architecture, even though it didn't have the signs anymore. And every time I passed that thing, I said, you know what? I need to get a shot of that. And I probably passed that thing 10 times. And every time I said the same thing. I need to get a shot of that. Then one day I went through Chelsea, and guess what wasn't there anymore? That Shell station. And guess who didn't have a shot of it? Well, you're looking at it. So I finally decided, you know what? I've been thinking about this for years. I need to do something about it. I eventually moved on from the NBC station. I started freelancing, doing the same thing that I was doing there, and that gave me a lot of time. What I did was, in December 2012, I got me a little Nikon camera. It wasn't a great camera, it was a little crop sensor camera, but it was good enough to do what I wanted to do. And I decided to just get my old Dodge truck and head out on the road and see what I could see. It was very random, I was very disorganized, I was very much a guy who didn't read the directions, to the point where I could drive 150 miles a day, or 200, whatever. I might see 2 or 3 different things, and it was very inefficient. And it was like I was getting nowhere, because Alabama's not a huge state, but it's a lot of ground I need to cover. So I finally decided I need to come up with an organized plan. I only shoot in the winter. So I decided in the summer of 2013, I was going to come up with an organized way to do this. And this is where we look at the screen. Now, Alabama's not a huge state here. Would it make more sense if I stood facing that way? Probably not. Anyway, I just feel weird standing up here. Anyway, it's not a huge state, but it's still 52,000 square miles. So what I decided to do was break the state up into sections, 16 roughly equal sections. And what I was going to do is use Google satellite maps, and I was going to scan every mile of every state and every federal highway in the entire state of Alabama, one section at a time. When I was looking, I found that in PowerPoint, and I thought it was really cool. Anyway, what I'm doing here is I'm scanning along here, and I'm looking for anything that catch my eye. And I actually got pretty good at this, because things would stand out. I actually wasn't this high, but I'm doing it for illustrative purposes. Every time I'd find something I thought was cool, like this really cool old drive-in here, I'd go down to Street View, drag the little man down there, you put him on the road and see what it looks like, from, ground level. And it's like every time I saw something that I thought was cool, I would decide, yep, we're taking a shot of it. So I'd come back out, I'd put my little pin in it, I'd identify it, and then I'd go on and I'd start looking for the next thing. Wow, that was weird. Anyway, ultimately, that one thing became 10 things. Eventually, that became 100 things. And it's taken me many, many, many hours to do this. I mean, it's even the map still grows over the years. I make new maps. I made 100 maps, I can guarantee you that. But ultimately, I wound up finding somewhere in the neighborhood of around 2,500 different places I could go. Now, what am I looking for when I do this? Change, please, thank you. All right, this is a perfect example here of what I'm looking for. I see the beauty in all these places. I want to capture them in an aesthetically pleasing way. I want to, make them look as pretty as I think they are to me. So what I'm trying to do is shoot them in a very pretty way. Perfect example here. This is just a screenshot. It's an old abandoned garage in downtown Dothan. To look at the building, there's obviously no redeeming qualities to it. It's actually pretty ugly, but I really like those cool trifold doors there. Those collapsed either side. This is before they even had roll-up doors. The morning I was there, this was back in 2014, February, I think, around 7 o'clock in the morning. It was probably, it was like I took this shot and I absolutely hated it. Because, it's an ugly building as it is. The sun's too bright. I just don't know what I'm going to do with this. Then I happened to notice the shadow there from the street light, and the shadow's going through the window. So, I thought, I'm here. Let me see what I can do. So I walked around to the alley behind it and see if I can make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, and I actually wound up with something that I was actually very, very happy with. Out of the 40,000 photographs I've taken, that's probably still one of my top 10 favorites ever. Over in Cherokee County, this is one of the cotton wagons outside the old abandoned Jordan Gin. As y'all know, Alabama is the cotton state. In 1849, Alabama was producing 23% of the nation's cotton crop, and the United States was the world's leading cotton producer. Then the war came along, the Yankees started blockading the ports, forced the price of cotton from 13 cents a pound up to around $1.01 a pound. Eventually got to the point where, you could get rich if you could get your cotton out, but you couldn't get it out. Southern governors were actually telling farmers, y'all quit growing cotton because we can't eat cotton. That was the start of the demise of cotton in Alabama. After that, you had to deal with Reconstruction, the weather, problems getting fertilizer, and the early 20th century you had to contend with the boll weevil. All of this combined to force farmers to diversify into other row crops such as corn, soybeans, and peanuts, to the point where Alabama doesn't even produce a tenth of what #1 Texas does. Up in Florence, this is the old Forks of Cypress plantation. It was built in 1830. It was actually designed by a very famous architect of the era, whose name was William Nichols. He designed a lot of the buildings at the University of Alabama campus. It was owned by an Irish immigrant. His name was James Jackson. Near as I can figure, he must have been really wealthy, because apparently all he did for a living was raise horses and race horses. Stayed in the family for many years, eventually changed hands several times. Ultimately it wound up becoming a museum until July 1966, when it got struck by lightning and burned to the ground. The interesting thing was, I'm actually going on private property when I took this shot. And I don't trespass, trust me. Anyway, what I found who owned the place. It's a doctor. It's actually a married couple. They're both doctors. And I said, I asked him if I could go shoot it, and he said, sure. Anyway, when I was getting up there and I was getting real close, and because he told me the day before, just call him when I got close. And I said, okay, cool. So I got close, I called him, he says, hey, I'm busy, just climb over the fence. So what did I do? I climbed over the fence. And the neighbors keep an eye on the place, so they gave me kind of a weird look when they drove by. Over in Perry County, just south of Marion, it's a little roadside park. When I was growing up, this was your fast food restaurant. When you were going from Huntsville to Gulf Shores, that was 10 or 11 hours of hell in the backseat of a station wagon with an annoying little brother. So what would happen is your mom would pack a lunch, y'all drive 4 or 5 hours, you pull over to one of these little roadside parks. There were literally nothing more than a few concrete tables and some trash cans. Now there's a McDonald's on every corner. The state doesn't even maintain these anymore. In fact, I actually went back by this year. I was close to it, and I was going to go back, since I'm close, I'll go back and reshoot it. And it's gone. So I can't even go back and do that anymore. Over in Talladega County, the old Waldo Covered Bridge, the only abandoned covered bridge that I'm aware of in the entire state. It was built in 1858. It said that Straits Raiders, or a bunch of Yankees, they actually would cross this bridge, going from point A to point B while they trashed and burned their way through Alabama. After the war was over, they decided, it was just a regular road that the state maintained, until around the early 1960s when they finally shut it down because it was very dangerous. In fact, you can still see the sign up there, it says bridge condemned. People actually talk about preserving the bridge or restoring it, but it's not really close to anything. Near as I can figure, unless somebody does something relatively soon, that bridge is eventually going to collapse. Down in Escambia County, I was down at Atmore. I was doing the library down there, and after I got done, it was like this lady with the Chamber of Commerce came up to me and says, hey, you want to go see a jail on wheels? It's like, well, duh. So we headed out to the edge of town, and it was a salvage yard way outside of town there. In fact, and not only that, it had been raining for, this huge place, and it had been raining a lot, so we had to go out in the owner's four-wheel drive truck before we finally got out here. How many of y'all seen the movie Cool Hand Luke? All right, you remember the chain gangs and the convicts, and they're out working on the road, right? Well, here's the thing. There was a lot of trouble getting them up, getting them fed, load them up, take them out to the work site. You know where I'm going with all this. So somebody came up with this idea, why don't we do an RV for convicts? So this is built by the Manley Steel Corporation, late 19th century, early 20th century. Entire intent was, they built bunks in it, they put a stove in it, and the convicts would actually camp out on the work site. They'd even cover it with canvas at night, in case it was raining and all like that. Up in Paint Rock in Jackson County, this is way up in North Alabama. This is the foundation for the old Southern Railway Depot. It may not look like much right now, but on March 25th, 1931, this is, it's 1931, so the Depression's been going on, a year and a half now. Everybody's out of work. The way everybody got around was riding a freight train. Up near Chattanooga, it was like, there was these white teenagers and these black teenagers, and they were kind of street brawling to see who was going to get on the boxcar heading west. Ultimately, the black teenagers managed to run off and hop on the freight car, and they head back down into Alabama. What happened was, because these white kids were so annoyed about that, they got a hold of the Jackson County Sheriff. The sheriff went down and stopped the train in Paint Rock and made everybody get off of it. Turns out one of those boxcars was these 2 white women and these 9 black kids, and they went on to become the famous Scottsboro Boys, and it all started right here. Y'all might recognize this. I'm sure some of y'all do. Yes, sir.
Say that again. The who boys?
Scottsboro Boys.
Scottsboro. Okay.
All right. Do I need a megaphone? All right. Yeah. If y'all don't hear something, just holler at me. I don't mind repeating it. It's not that big a deal. How do you pronounce this? Uchi or Uchi? Uchi. Yeah. You know what? I've learned. Don't say something because somebody will correct me. I figure that out over and over again. So I'll just say, how do y'all pronounce that? And it just saves me a lot of trouble. Anyway, this is a Good Hope Baptist Church over in Uchi. I just thought I'd say that to annoy y'all. Anyway, it's built in 1859. Apparently y'all have a lot of problem with tornadoes around here. And apparently the story as I hear it is a tornado. Oh Lordy, y'all are really gonna make me do this, aren't you? Anyway, the story as I hear it is that they blew the back half of the church off and they took what they had left and closed the front end and just made a little short church, so that for all you Baptists in your 128 verses of Just As I Am, you're not even going to get through the first sentence and then you're done. Up in Summerville, up in North Alabama. Y'all hear me now? Oh, good thing I like the sound of my voice. Anyway, up in Summerville was founded in about maybe 8 or 9 days before Alabama became a state back in 1819. And their first order of business was to build a temporary jail for $137.50. Summerville was also designated the county seat of Coteco County, which in 1821 they renamed it to Morgan County. In 1825 they decided they wanted a permanent structure for a jail, which is what they have right here. It actually did function as a jail. It was also the post office and a polling station. People have lived in it from time to time. The house has actually sat abandoned for probably about 30 or 40 years. Over in Three Notch, over in neighboring Bullitt County, this was actually a depot for the Montgomery and Eufaula Railroad. It was built in 1870. Central of Georgia acquired it in 1879, and the Southern Railway acquired Central of Georgia, I believe, in 1963. They eventually shut down and took up all the tracks there and completely eliminated rail traffic there, and it wound up becoming a grocery store. So there you go. Over in Faunsdale in Marengo County, I was actually down there to shoot the old water tower, because it's a really cool rusty water tower. When I got down there, I saw this tiny little building behind it, and I thought, wonder what that is. So being the curious sort, I stuck my head in the door, and it's like, oh cool, it's a jail. So I crawled all the way back in here to get that really, what I thought was really cool shot. And by the way, you're looking at the entire jail. So now, technically, if anybody ever asks me if I've ever been in jail, I can say, well, technically yes. Over in Seal, interesting thing about Seal is the third county seat after Crawford, which was the second county seat of Russell County. There's an entire stretch of buildings here. I'm sure y'all all know this, but it was really cool to see. Well, the first time I saw this, it was just like, it was fascinating. It was just like an entire street of, abandoned buildings there. But I also noticed that the railroad tracks used to run behind it, so I'm assuming this is where the center of town used to be in Seal. Down in Baldwin County, this is the keel for the old merchant schooner Rachel. She was actually uncovered by a tropical storm probably about 8 or 9 years ago. People came up with all these crazy stories about its origin. They said, oh, it was a commerce raider or something sexy like that. And it's like, nope, it was a merchant schooner. It was a seagoing equivalent of a tractor trailer. It ran lumber back and forth between here and Cuba. Back in 1923, it was beached during a tropical storm. The boat survived intact. The boat's owner, got every tugboat he could find to try and drag it back into the water. He was unsuccessful, so he stripped the boat of everything that was usable and abandoned it. Somebody else came along later on and burned the thing to the ground. The theory was they were trying to salvage the iron nails out of it. The time, the weather, and sightseers have not been kind to the boat. And it was like, when it first washed ashore, there was probably about 4 times as much boat as you see right now. Over in Hurtsboro, the old Seaboard Airlines Railway Depot. Hurtsboro was apparently founded in 1857. It was incorporated in 1872. Apparently the Seaboard Airlines and the Central of Georgia both had depots there, and it was a very bustling little town until the railroads changed the way they did things, and apparently that just killed the town almost overnight. Apparently they've also had problems with tornadoes as well. Interesting thing I found out about Hurtsboro is it used to be called Hurtsville, but they had to change the name because, am I telling you all this stuff you already know? Hurtsville, it used to be Hurtsboro, it used to be Hurtsboro, but they had to change the name of it because it was confusing with Huntsville. So that's what happened to it. Over in Hale County, Green Chapel CME Church is built in 1893. I've been in a lot of abandoned churches in Alabama, and they all look pretty much alike. It's like, the pews, the altar, the things like that. What I really liked was these silk flowers up here on the front, and that became my focal point, kind of life in an otherwise dead place. The interesting thing is there's other people on my Forgotten Alabama page, and they also know about this church, and they also go in here, and they also take pictures, and sometimes they move the basket, and it annoys me. So every time I'm anywhere in the neighborhood and I'm close to the church, I'm going to go back in here, and if the basket's not where it's supposed to be, I will pick it up and put it back on its post. Up in Arkadelphia, it's about halfway between Jasper and Coleman. Arkadelphia was founded in 1820. It was part of Walker County. Arkadelphia has an interesting history. In 1850, the state redrew the county lines, making it part of Blount County. In 1854, they established a post office here. It was also a stagecoach stop on the road from Tuscaloosa to Huntsville. And then in 1901, they redrew the county lines again, making it part of Coleman County, so it had actually been in its existence in 3 separate counties. The post office is over there on the left, and I'll give y'all a free book if y'all tell me what that building is on the right. I got all night, don't worry about it. Y'all ain't never gonna guess it, I'm just gonna tell you. It's a movie theater. Isn't it obvious? Now in Covington County, just outside of River Falls, this is the old Horseshoe Lumber Company. It was built in the late 19th century. It was the largest lumber mill within a 50-mile radius. It had railroad tracks running in every direction, bringing timber in there to be cut up for lumber. Eventually, they modernized the place in 1923. Everything was humming along fine until March of 1929. See, the Horseshoe Lumber Company sits on the banks of the Conecuh River. Well, just around March 13th, it started raining in the area, and it rained for 3 straight days to the point where it swelled the Conecuh River as much as 19 feet above flood stage. What happened was it wound up wiping out the entire mill. It washed away all the machinery, locomotives, all the freight cars, everything was just totally destroyed here. And at that point, they decided they were going to close up shop and walk away. So you're actually looking at it pretty much as it sat for the last 90 years. Down in Hayneville, which is, in Lowndes County, south of Montgomery, there's a really cool little church. Somebody actually posted it on my Forgotten Alabama page, and I didn't believe it was in Alabama. Because you got to realize, I've been all over Alabama. I've seen churches everywhere. And, it's like I know the architecture. I know what, because believe it or not, the architecture changes from one end of the state to the other. This one didn't fit anything I'd ever seen. Then a friend of mine who lives, kind of close to that says, yeah, it's in Alabama, and he told me where it was. I managed to go down there and get a shot of it. Problem was I couldn't find out the name of it. About a year later, I was heading south on 65, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to duck in, go down to Hayneville, go to the library, and see if I could find somebody there who knew. The librarian didn't know, but she did know who would know. It's this old lady with the Historical Society there, and she makes it her job to know every bit of history about, Lowndes County. She gave me her phone number, and fortunately, she actually answered the phone and didn't, once I explained who I was and I wasn't some crazy stalker, it was like, she gave me her email address, I emailed her the photographs, and she emailed me back. She said she didn't know the name of that church. She didn't even know that church existed. She's lived in Lowndes County all her life. She didn't know that church existed. So anyway, she also turned out to be the perfect person to do this because she loves a mystery. About 3 weeks later, she called me back. She found out the name. It's Little Christian Church. But the interesting thing about this, no, it's Little. The real name is Little. Disciples of Christ. The interesting thing was this was a black Christian church. And it's like, back then, you had white Baptists and black Baptists, and you had white Christian, white Disciples of Christ and black ones. It was built in 1882. They used the church for probably about 50 years. They sold it off to a holiness congregation who used it till the last person died off. Apparently the church has probably sat vacant for about 40 or 50 years. Up in Opelika, the last remaining remnant of the old Camp Opelika, which is prisoner of war camp from World War II, had predominantly German prisoners, some Italian prisoners there. After the war was over, it was actually student housing, for, like the college up there. And then it became eventually just low rent housing. And then they tore everything down except for this last building, which I'm told was an old administrative building. I actually was up in Opelika probably this past February. I'm close, I'm just going to go back and reshoot it, and it turns out they tore it down. So I don't have another chance to do that either. Over in Eufaula is the old Vicksburg and Brunswick Depot. It was built in 1872. The Vicksburg and Brunswick was actually formed in 1869. They had this grandiose plan that they were going to build tracks all the way down to Troy, and then turn around, head north, and they were going to go to Greenville and ultimately end up in Marina, Mississippi. So it was going to make kind of like a giant backwards check mark. Well, they only made it 22 miles away to neighboring Clayton, and they ran out of money. I suppose because they spent it all in this very extravagant depot here. The railroad changed hands many, many times before it eventually wound up being owned by the Central of Georgia. Over in Talladega County, this is one of the last, this is a significant part of Alabama history that almost nobody even knows about. This is one of the last remaining remnants, and I don't even know what it is, of the Alabama Army ammunition plant. Back in 1941, the government got together with DuPont to build a munitions factory for World War II. At its height, it had around 25,000 people working there, and it was cranking out about 40 million pounds of ammunition a month. Towards the latter part of the war, it was also involved in the production of heavy water, which was used for the atomic bomb. After the war was over, they put the plant on standby. They eventually shut it down in August of 1945. They tried leasing out some of the buildings there for commercial purposes, and then it came to be discovered the ground was highly contaminated from all this munitions manufacturing, to the point where this actually was an EPA Superfund site at one time. Thing is I've wandered all around here, and I'm really happy I don't glow. Up in North Alabama, actually this is in Morgan County, there's a highway, if you've ever headed north on 65, and it's called the University of North Alabama Highway. It's Alabama 157. You get off in Coleman, and you head northwest up towards Florence. Well, you go about 15 miles down, and you go down a steep hill, and then like over on the right, there's like a junkyard, and then there's this one lone thing sitting out here out front. I thought it was a hearse, because I mean, it has this appearance of being a hearse. I drove by that thing probably 20 times, and every time I could never get inside because it's behind a fence. It was either raining or the fence was closed or whatever. This past March, I was coming back down 157, and it was a bright day, a few clouds in the sky. It was a perfect day, and it's like, oh, please let the gate be open, please, please. I come down there, the gate is open. I whoop in there, and the first thing I meet is these two junkyard dogs. Now, here's the thing, I grew up with dogs, okay? You know when a dog's being a badass, but he doesn't really mean it, and you know when a dog's gonna eat you. One of those dogs was gonna eat me, and I mean, I was genuinely terrified. I'm wandering around, there's nobody there, it's just the dogs. I'm wandering through this junky office, and I was hollering hello in between incessant barking. And eventually I found some guy living in a mobile home on the property, and I said, is it okay for me to be here? And he said, sure. I go back over here, these dogs are circling me all the time. One of them keeps bumping me with his nose, and I just know he's just waiting to take a chunk out of me. I get up here, I get a shot of it. In fact, this is one of the few shots I managed to get without a dog running through the photograph there. The interesting thing is, you see that door there? There's some words stenciled on the side of that door, and the only word I could make out was the word quarantine. I was like, oh wow, this is so cool. I mean, this thing might have had bubonic plague patients in it or something like that. Anyway, I didn't have time to sit out there because these dogs were eventually going to eat me, so I took as good a photograph of that door, got back in my truck. In fact, my door was open that wide, and there was a nose sticking in there. And I thought about introducing him to my friend, Mr. Beretta, but then I thought that's too much paperwork. Anyway, I managed to escape. I got home. I started looking at that photograph, and I started making out other words. And then, all right, I found the word bureau. And then I found, articles, like of and the, that kind of thing. And it was like, eventually I managed to piece together enough words that I could put it in a Google search and see what it would bring up. Pull it in there, boom, there's my answer. Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Entomology and Plant Quarantine. And it's like, oh, God, I was crushed. Anyway, if y'all care, it's a 1949 Pontiac Silver Streak panel delivery. Down in Covington County, just outside of Red Level, is this cool old farmhouse I found totally by accident. This is why I do what I do, because probably about 3 years ago, somebody actually posted on the page there of it in flames because it got struck by lightning, and it also no longer exists. Up in Birmingham, just off Finley Avenue, is the old Southern Railway Roundhouse. This is actually a 3-shot panorama, if any of y'all actually like shoot or anything like that. It's like 3 separate photographs that's stitched together. Anyway, it was built in 1915 by Southern Railway. It had 26 stalls in it. It's a huge roundhouse, the biggest roundhouse I've ever seen in my life. Southern operated it until 1952 when they relocated their operations up to Irondale. It was a moving and storage company for a while. It's changed hands several times. I actually have no idea who owns it right now. All I know is the ironic thing, this is listed as a places in peril in Alabama. And it's like, this thing's solid concrete. Every one of us is more in peril than this place is. Cardui helps women. I found this tacked to an old building down in a little town called St. Clair over in Lowndes County. I had no idea what it was. So when I got home, I looked it up. Turns out it's made by the Chattanooga Medicine Company. It was a tonic. You could buy it in any store. It was for women to help alleviate the pain of menstrual cramps. As I kept reading, I also found out it was 19% alcohol by volume. So y'all have to explain that part to me. I don't get it. Up in Shelby County, actually in a little town called Shelby, it's actually not terribly far from where I live. This is the old Shelby Hotel. All right, well, this is actually not the old Shelby Hotel. This was the newer Shelby Hotel. The original one was built in 1863, actually served as a hospital for the Confederacy. It burned in 1898. They rebuilt the hotel as the one you see right there in 1900, said to be the very first hotel in the entire state of Alabama to have both running water and electricity. Unfortunately, about 3 or 4 months ago, it also mysteriously burned to the ground, and now nobody seems to know why, and it's just a mystery fire because there's no electricity in it. It was obviously set. Up in Tallapoosa County, in a little town called Camp Hill. If y'all ever been to Camp Hill or I don't know how far Camp Hill is from here. Shouldn't be that far, would it? I wouldn't think so. Anyway, I remember going through Camp Hill when you know, my parents go to Auburn, go to homecoming. And it was like, 280 went right through town. Then let me tell you something. The State Highway Department has amazing, they can choose who lives and who dies. I can just tell you that right now. I've seen it over and over and over again. What they did was, the first time they rerouted 280 to the edge of town, then they decided they were going to 4-lane 280, so they put it even further away from town to the point where you wouldn't even know Camp Hill existed were it not for a metal sign out on the highway. If you've ever been through Camp Hill, it's a ghost town. I mean, like what buildings, all the buildings are abandoned. I mean, I believe there's one shop in the police department. That's pretty much all there is down there on the main drag through town. This was the entrance to Winter's Grocery, and I really like those cool doors there, so that's why I got that shot. Down in Bayou La Batre in Mobile County, this thing showed up many years ago, and people thought, it was a captured Soviet spy submarine. Well, yes, kind of no. It is Soviet. It was built during the Cold War, sometime between 1968 and 1972. Its name was the Sever Bis II, S-E-V-E-R-B-I-S 2. It has a sister ship that's called the Sever Bis. Near as I could figure out translating from Russian, Bis apparently means south, and that's the only thing I could get out of it. But here's that's where the Soviet part really ends, because they were research submarines. They were doing oceanographic research, inspecting fisheries and things like that. They were in service about 10, 12 years before they eventually pulled them out, left them to rust away in some Soviet shipyard. Some enterprising American entrepreneur decided, you know what? I'm going to buy this thing and I'm going to bring it back to the States. So he took it all the way down, parked it in the Steiner shipyard in Bayou La Batre. The story was that he was going to fix it up, a little paint, a little Bondo, it should be good to go, right? Anyway, he was going to do undersea tours of the Gulf of Mexico. That was the story. Sometime in the 1990s, he told them he was going out of town, he'd be back, and nobody's seen or heard from him ever since. So it's actually been sitting down there for the last 27, 28 years. Over in, this is a vertical lift bridge. It's called the Omaha Bridge of the Seaboard Airlines Railroad. I'm actually standing in Georgia when I took this shot, so Omaha, Georgia is like to the left, and you're looking across the Chattahoochee, it's actually going into Cottonton, which is, in Russell County. Technically speaking, only the right half of the bridge would be considered Forgotten Alabama. The left half would obviously be Forgotten Georgia. Up in Huntsville, this is a 1947 Keller Super Chief. George Keller, he was a sales executive with Studebaker. he decided, you know what, I want to go into the car manufacturing business myself. So he got some investors, some engineers together, and he founded the Keller Car Corporation. By 1948, he had around 70 people on payroll and around 1,600 dealers across the country, ready to make the car. And by 1949, he had all his financing, all his means of production in place, and he was ready to go into full-scale production when he dropped dead of a heart attack at the age of 56. The company tried to recover, but eventually was unsuccessful, and they closed up their doors. These were actually built out on Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville. Only 18 were ever manufactured, and only 3 are known to still exist. Over in Lowndes County, just a little country store there. It used to be called Till's Place. It was, was bought and then changed the name to Chance's Place. It was just, your typical little store, with gas pumps and, basic, groceries and things like that. The difference was this place had a dance hall in the back, and on the back of that it had a deck and it overlooked a small lake. They had lots of live music there. Hank Williams was said to have played here many, many times. There's 3 things Hank Williams loved. He loved his music, he loved his booze, and he loved to fight. And apparently he got more than one bar fight in this very place here, to the point where it would spill out on the deck and eventually people would actually get thrown into that lake. Over in Monroe County, I got friends that live all over Alabama. They, we all know our particular areas, and if they want to know something where I live, I'll help them out with directions, all like that. Well, I was down in Monroe County, and I got a hold of a friend of mine who lives down in Monroeville, and I says, "What you got down here that I don't know about?" She said, "Well, have you ever heard of the Whore Church?" I said, "The what church?" She said, "The Whore Church." I said, "I'm not familiar with the Whore denomination." Well, it turns out this particular church has 2 separate cemeteries. And the story was, is that one cemetery was for the righteous and one cemetery was for the less than righteous. As it turns out, that's probably not really true. There's a fenced cemetery and an unfenced cemetery. And apparently the unfenced one was more like a pauper cemetery. So if you had money, you could spend eternity behind a chain link fence. There you go. Down, where are we? I guess we are up from here in Billingsley in Autauga County. Remember, I'm looking at satellite maps, so I'm seeing this stuff all from space, right? Well, anyway, this was the very first town I saw that actually had their name emblazoned on the roof of a building here. And I thought, wow, what kind of an ego do they have? And not only that, they didn't plan ahead and they had to hyphenate. As it turns out, these things have significance. This is called an airway marking. What that was is the Department of Commerce back in the late 1930s set up the Airways Marking Commission, and its specific purpose was to identify every town in the country by painting the town's name on the roof of the largest building in town. By the time the thing had really been going a while, there was over 10,000 of these roofs painted out throughout the entire country. And you want to know why? So pilots knew where they were. This is before they had radar. This was their navigation. They'd literally look out the window and figure out where they were. This continued up until through World War II. It eventually got to the point by the latter part of the war, towns on the eastern seaboard had to paint over the roofs so the Germans wouldn't know where they were when they came over here with their super long-range heavy-duty bombers. After the war was over, radar was fairly common, and ultimately the practice was abandoned by the late 1940s. I've driven, as y'all are probably aware, I've driven all over Alabama. I've probably seen about a dozen of these. So if you're ever out and you see, typically they painted them on cotton gins because they had a big roof. It'd be maroon with yellowish gold letters. If you ever see a town's name painted like that on there, you know that was a legitimate airway marking. Over in Dallas County, this is Good Hope Baptist Church. A friend of mine posted this on the page, about 3 or 4 years ago. I fell in love with it. It was the atypical forgotten Alabama structure to me, a little abandoned church on a dirt road in rural Alabama. I was actually last year, about a year and a half ago, I was kind of close. I thought, you know what, I'm close to my little church. I'm going to go back by and check on it and see how it's doing. And turns out that it's not. It has also collapsed. Over on Highway 31, probably about 30 miles, what?
Step over the side, someone kind of look around you, man.
Step over the side and do what?
They're looking around you. See the picture?
Picture.
You're good, keep going.
You want me to crouch? Am I in the way? Yes, I am, but I'm modest. Continuing on, have you taken any pictures yet? All right, just checking on you. All right. This is a caboose for the Western Railway of Alabama. The interesting thing is, you're going down Highway 31, it was like woods, 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 caboose, woods, woods, woods. I mean, it just stuck out like a sore thumb. The thing, because it was only like about 75 yards off the highway. What I couldn't figure out is why it was there. Eventually, probably about 6 months after I took this photograph, a friend of mine who lives down in Lower Alabama says, hey, that caboose is gone. I said, how could it be gone? It weighs 20 tons. There's no wheels on it. It's not like you can just go in there and drag it out. And it remained a mystery for about 3 or 4 months till he found out what happened to it. This caboose and a wooden caboose were both purchased in an estate auction, and they were by a cattle farm down in Crenshaw County, and they got them both, drug them back down there to fix them up. As it turns out, they decided they were only going to fix up the wood caboose. I've actually talked to the woman who owns this caboose, and she wanted to sell it to me for what she paid for it, which is around $1,800, plus around $10,000 shipping and handling. Over on Highway 80, in neighboring Macon County, this is what I like to call the road to oblivion. It's actually not it. It just had this really cool Twilight Zone effect to it. But it's actually the old Montgomery Highway Bridge. It's east of Shorter. Just out in the middle of nowhere. In fact, the other Highway 80 is probably about 75 yards to the right of it. But if you get there at the right time of year, you get all those leaves on it and all like that, it's just really creepy looking. I loved it. Up in Huntsville, well, not Huntsville, actually northwestern Madison County, a significant part of Alabama history. This is the Urquhart House. It was built in 1813. This is 6 years before Alabama became a state. Now, interesting quirk of my life, my personal life here, back when I was a teenager, what was that, 10, 12 years ago, something like that? Anyway, back when I was a teenager, me and my friends used to hang out on this guy's farm up in northwestern Madison County. And he had this really, the guy there, he had this really cool old house there. And we'd camp out in that old house. I mean, it was like, I didn't think anything of it. Turns out this is the exact same house from back when I was a teenager. And I came out and wound up documenting the same thing. It was 45 years later, okay? Anyway, it was just like my life just came full circle on that, and I had no idea that I was actually standing in history that I wound up documenting. Over in Randolph County, and I don't really know anything about this house. I was actually going up to go shoot at the old post office when I was going down the dirt road. I was probably about 2 or 3 miles from Georgia, and I passed this thing, and it was just one of the most fascinating things I ever seen. It's like an entire 40-acre farm, and all of it's covered by kudzu. And keep in mind, this is the dead of winter when I shot this, so I mean, I can't imagine how little of this farm you can actually see when it's like, warm outside. And over in Elmore County, the old Tallahassee Mill is built by the Tallahassee Falls Manufacturing Company in 1841. It was the second textile mill built in Alabama. They did cotton, make cotton fabric. They eventually branched out into wool. During the war, the Richmond Armory had to flee from Virginia to keep from being overrun by the Yankees. It relocated here. It was the only armory of the Confederacy that actually survived the war. After the war was over, they went back to textile production until they shut down in 2004, making it the longest continually operated textile mill in the entire country. And finally, down in Sumter County, this is Coatopa Presbyterian Church. There are 2 things I absolutely love to shoot: the Milky Way and obviously old stuff. The thing is like, you can't see the Milky Way in the winter because of, where we are in an orbit around the sun. You can see the Milky Way great in the dead of summer, but then everything's all grown up. So what I decided to do was I split the difference. I left my house about 2 o'clock in the morning in the middle of April, drove 2 hours to get down here. When I finally got down here, it was about 45 degrees, everything was soaking wet, it was miserable. I strapped a 12-volt light bulb to a pine tree so I could light up the church, and then I took my shot. When I took like 30 or 40 photos, and I got home, I was so tired I couldn't even hardly stay awake, so I just decided I'll look at my photos later. When I finally got up and started going through them, it's like, oh cool, there's a meteor. I didn't even realize I had that. Anyway, that's pretty much it. I'm gonna leave y'all with, well, actually, if you're interested, you can join my Forgotten Alabama group. Just go to, groups, Forgotten Alabama 1819. Anyway, I'm gonna leave y'all with this passing thought here. Look around at the things you see every single day. Your church, where you buy gas, whatever, even the Dollar General. I notice y'all have a Dollar General, y'all are uptown now. Anyway, 100 years from now, none of this will exist, not a single bit of it. Take pictures of everything. You go back and look at an old black and white photograph from 50 years ago, and that's the most fascinating thing you ever saw. And you got to realize 50 years ago when they took that photograph, it was probably more than likely a very mundane topic. So anyway, just so y'all know, I have 3 books out. My first book over there is the one with the bricks on it. That came out in 2016. The blue one, actually I also did that, and that's More Forgotten Alabama. I did that in 2016. And then the one in the middle is 200 Years of Forgotten Alabama. And that's obviously my bicentennial edition. If you're interested, I hope you are, but if you're interested, my newest book is $40. The other books are $30. However, if you buy the new book, you get either of those or both for half price. And other than that, y'all ain't got nothing else. Y'all are, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank y'all.